A white cop assaults a black woman in broad daylight, but what he doesn't know is she's the highest ranking judge in the entire state. What happens next doesn't just shatter his career, it shakes an entire city, forces a system to confront its darkest truths, and sparks a movement that redefines justice in America. You won't believe who she really is and how this one moment rewrites everything. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. It began like any other morning in Charleston, a quiet golden hush draped across the historic city as the first light brushed against the pastel buildings of King Street. Cafes opened their shutters with the lazy rhythm of a weekend tourists, ambled along cobblestone sidewalks, and the scent of salt water drifted in from the harbor. But what no one expected that morning was that a single moment lasting less than 2 minutes would bring the city to its knees. Officer Kyle Mercer wasn't a new name in the Charleston Police Department. With 15 years under his belt, a chest full of commendations, and a reputation for being firm, he was both respected and feared by younger recruits. But among community members, especially those who weren't white, he was a whisper of warning. "Watch your words around Mercer," they'd say. "He doesn't ask. He decides." That morning, Mercer cruised slowly through the city in his marked SUV, the windows down just enough to let the morning air roll through. His hand tapped lightly on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning not for trouble, but for something that didn't fit. That's how he described it. Professional instinct, he called it. Others had another word: profiling. Near the corner of King and Broad, he saw her, a black woman, alone, standing outside an upscale boutique, with a canvas tote slung over her shoulder and a phone in her hand. She wasn't moving, erratically, wasn't shouting, wasn't loitering. She was simply waiting. Maybe for a ride, maybe for the store to open. But to Mercer, she looked out of place, too composed, too self-assured. And in his experience, that meant hiding something. He pulled over. Alicia Monroe didn't flinch when the cruiser stopped beside her. She didn't step away. She didn't even look surprised. She turned calm as the breeze rolling off the coast and faced him. "Ma'am," Mercer said as he stepped out of the vehicle. "May I see some identification?" "Is there a reason?" she asked, voice steady, respectful. "I asked for ID," he repeated, his tone flattening. "You're standing in front of a closed business, and that's against the law." She asked again, not with defiance, but clarity. That was enough. He stepped closer. Too close. "You're refusing to comply," he said. "No," she replied. "I'm asking for justification." What happened next was fast and horrifying. Without warning, Mercer grabbed her arm. When she instinctively pulled back, he shoved her. Hard. The woman, a petite figure in her early 50s, hit the ground with a thud that echoed off the brick buildings. Her phone clattered across the sidewalk. People screamed. A couple rushed over phones already recording. One man yelled, "You can't do that." But Mercer had already drawn himself to full height, glaring down at the woman as though she were a threat. But Alicia Monroe never yelled. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She slowly propped herself up on one elbow, brushing gravel from her palm, and looked straight at him. "I'll get up," she said. "But make no mistake, your authority does not come from pushing people down." It wasn't just the words, it was how she said them, controlled, measured, like someone who had once taught those very words to others in a courtroom. Mercer stood frozen for a moment, caught between the authority he wore on his chest and the shame rising in his throat. The woman stood up. Her tote had spilled papers fluttering along the sidewalk, one of them bearing an official state seal, another with a letterhead that read, "Office of Legal Affairs." But Mercer didn't notice. Or maybe he chose not to. The crowd did. The camera phones caught every second, and the videos, raw and searing, were online before Alicia even dusted off her skirt. Within the hour, hashtags were being typed. By noon, the video had crossed state lines. By sunset, it was on every major news outlet in the country. But the name of the woman in the video wasn't known yet, not fully. All the world saw was an older black woman being thrown to the pavement by a white cop for asking a question he didn't like, for demanding respect he wasn't willing to give. And yet what no one knew, what would come to shake the very foundation of the Charleston Police Department, was who exactly Alicia Monroe was. But that revelation, that was still to come. What mattered now was the footage, a simple clip, a brutal act, and a woman's voice, calm, unwavering, reminding the world that dignity doesn't crumble when it's thrown to the ground. Not when it was built, brick by brick, in a system that long tried to erase it. This wasn't just another case of police misconduct. It was the beginning of something far more powerful. The truth was about to surface, and Charleston would never be the same again. The city of Charleston had known unrest before. It had seen protests in Marion Square and heard speeches echo off the columns of the old courthouse steps. But this time, something felt different, something heavier, something too raw to ignore. The video of Officer Kyle Mercer pushing Alicia Monroe to the pavement wasn't just another blip in the endless cycle of police overreach. It pierced through the noise. There was no ambiguity, no shaky camera, no background context to distort. Just a white officer, a black woman, and a violent silence after a question that was never answered. By mid-afternoon, the footage had spread across neighborhoods and office buildings. Screens lit up in cafes, barbershops, and buses. Strangers who never made eye contact were now standing shoulder to shoulder, watching a slow-motion replay of a woman's dignity being slammed into concrete. Conversations erupted, not just about race, but about arrogance, about justice, about the terrifying ease with which power could be abused. The mayor's office issued a brief statement, carefully worded sanitized, for public consumption. "The incident is under review," it read. "We urge citizens to remain calm while facts are gathered," but no one was interested in calm. The facts were already public. No one needed a report to see what had happened. What people needed was accountability. By 6 p.m., a crowd had formed outside the Charleston Police Department headquarters. Some held signs, "Protect, don't assault justice for Alicia. We saw everything." Others held candles. The air vibrated with a quiet intensity, the kind that comes not from rage, but from collective clarity. This wasn't a demand for change. It was a declaration that change was already underway. In the crowd, retired school teachers stood next to high school seniors. Parents brought children and whispered softly to them about courage, about fairness, about the kind of world they wanted to leave behind. A local pastor stepped forward and recited a passage from Isaiah, not with fire and brimstone, but with mourning and grace. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, he said. The words floated over the people like a benediction and a warning. Inside the police department, the mood was different. Officers stood in clusters, hushed, uncertain. Some had worked with Mercer for years. Others had always been uneasy around him, but never said so aloud. Now their silence felt like complicity. One young officer, no more than a year, on the force looked out the window at the crowd and whispered, "We did this." No one responded. That night, the city council held an emergency session. Councilwoman Teresa Hayward, a black woman who had grown up in North Charleston, took the floor. Her voice trembled not from fear, but from restraint. We cannot speak of accountability if our first instinct is to protect the badge over the person it harmed, she said. That woman is not just a victim. She's a mirror. And we must look. The room fell silent. Even the council members, who often played defense for law enforcement, said nothing. Not because they had changed overnight, but because the political cost of inaction had shifted. This time, defending Mercer didn't feel like defending order. It felt like defending decay. Meanwhile, Alicia Monroe remained silent. Her identity had not yet been made public. She had been taken to the hospital for a sprained wrist and minor bruises, but she had refused interviews. She hadn't returned calls from journalists or activists. Her absence only deepened the mystery and magnified the moment. The woman in the video had become a symbol, and symbols once born are no longer owned by the people they represent. But those who knew her were not silent. At the Charleston School of Law, a professor who had once clerked under Alicia, though no one yet knew she was Judge Alicia Monroe, posted a message to faculty. If the woman in that video is who I think she is, the city will soon learn that justice just got personal. At a nearby church, a former student recalled a speech she had once given on judicial restraint, in which she said, "The law must not only protect the innocent, it must humble the powerful." That quote began circulating online. No name was attached to it, just the words. And for many, that was enough. By the second night, the protest had grown. Musicians brought instruments and played soft jazz as people laid flowers on the sidewalk where Alicia had fallen. Someone brought chalk and wrote her words on the pavement in huge block letters. Your authority does not come from pushing people down. The city watched, waited, and remembered. Because Alicia Monroe was not just another person brutalized by a badge. She was about to become the voice that Charleston could no longer ignore. And as the city held its breath, what it didn't yet realize was that Alicia wasn't just returning to speak. She was returning to lead. The sun had barely risen over Charleston when the first rumor slipped into the city like a whisper carried by the tide. The woman in the video wasn't just a civilian. She wasn't just a name or a face captured in a moment of brutality. She was Judge Alicia Monroe, Senior Justice of the South Carolina Court of Appeals. And the man who had shoved her officer Kyle Mercer had just assaulted his superior. No official statement confirmed it. No press conference announced it. But the people who mattered already knew. A quiet murmur in the courthouse. A text among clerks. A phone call between attorneys. And then, like all truths too powerful to be contained, it leaked. A local journalist, sharp patient, and always 3 steps ahead, posted the story mid-morning. A single headline stripped of drama, but bursting with weight, officer in viral assault video identified as judge's subordinate. Beneath the headline was a still frame of the video paused at the exact moment Officer Mercer extended his arm to shove Alicia. Her face composed, even in that instant stared back at the world with quiet defiance. The article needed no embellishment. Alicia Monroe's judicial record spoke for itself. 2 decades on the bench, known for her integrity, her command of the law, and her unwavering sense of fairness. She had ruled in cases involving civil rights violations, corruption, wrongful arrests. She had written opinions cited in legal textbooks across the state. And now she had become a victim of the very injustice she had spent her life dismantling. Charleston did not react with shock. It reacted with revelation. The truth didn't spark a new fire. It poured gasoline on one already burning. In police precincts, officers sat stunned, their radios buzzing with static. Some scrambled to delete old messages. Others looked at each other with something between fear and shame. Officer Mercer, now suspended pending investigation, had not spoken publicly. But inside the department, silence fell like judgment. In the mayor's office, panic rippled like heat through stone. Damage control became impossible. Statements drafted overnight were trashed. Every excuse that might have held had now collapsed under the weight of context. A racist incident was one thing. A racist assault against a black woman, who was also one of the highest judicial authorities in the state, that was something else entirely. At the state capitol, meetings were called. Phones rang off the hook. The governor's aides scrambled to find photos, any clip or quote that might align their narrative with Alicia Monroe's history. But Alicia had never aligned herself with power for convenience. She had built her career on accountability, and now that standard stood like a mirror before them all. But amidst the institutional scrambling, the public's reaction was something quieter, deeper, and more visceral. For many in Charleston's black community, the reveal was not just vindication, it was a spiritual unmasking. This wasn't just about one officer or one judge. It was about every moment someone had been dismissed, doubted, or dehumanized based on how they looked, rather than who they were. Older residents recalled the days of segregated courthouses, where black citizens entered through side doors and were addressed by their first names, regardless of title or age. To them, Alicia's experience wasn't an anomaly. It was a chilling echo. She earned everything they tried to strip away in one shove, a local community leader said, and now they'll have to answer for it. At the law school, downtown professors paused lectures to discuss the ethics of power and perception. Students who had memorized Monroe's rulings in legal theory class now stared at her image on the screen with renewed awe. This isn't just a case study, one student said. It's a reminder that law without humanity is just bureaucracy. Social media exploded, not with rage, but with reverence. Quotes from Alicia's old speeches resurfaced. Clips from her commencement addresses went viral. In one, she stood at a podium and said, "Justice cannot afford to wear a blindfold if it means ignoring the truth." That sentence, delivered years ago, now felt prophetic. But Alicia Monroe herself remained silent. She did not hold a press conference. She issued no fiery statement. Her silence wasn't avoidance. It was intention. She knew the storm would speak for her, and when she finally did speak, it would not be to defend herself. It would be to demand something bigger than apologies. In her home, away from cameras and politics, Alicia sat with her hands folded around a worn notebook. It was the same notebook she had carried into courtrooms, into law school lectures, into bar association meetings. And now it held a single sentence she had written the night before. The cost of silence is always paid by those without power. She hadn't written it for herself. She had written it for the system that had failed to recognize her until it was forced to. A system that still believed it could separate justice from appearance. She knew what would come next: calls for reform, performative outrage, and eventually the slow grind of policy meetings. But she was not interested in surface change. She wanted reckoning. That afternoon, Alicia stepped into the courthouse not as a victim, not even as a judge, but as a citizen with nothing left to prove. When her colleagues saw her, they stood not by rule, not by formality, but by instinct. Because she had become more than her title. She had become the embodiment of what happens when quiet dignity is struck and still refuses to bow. And the city knew, whether it admitted it or not, that the real verdict had already been delivered. And it wasn't Alicia Monroe who had been judged. It was all of them. When the reckoning came, it didn't come with fireworks or flashing lights. It came in the form of quiet meetings behind closed doors. It came in community halls filled with people who had carried the same bruises, some visible, some not, for generations. And it came through the silence that followed when even those in power realized that this time their usual playbook wouldn't work. The video of Officer Kyle Mercer assaulting Judge Alicia Monroe had ignited national attention, but it was the reveal of her identity that cracked the system open. Charleston was no longer dealing with a case of police misconduct. It was now confronting a legacy of institutional rot that could no longer be swept into a corner. It had a name, a face, a reputation, and it had dignity that refused to be buried. Within 72 hours, the South Carolina Judicial Ethics Committee launched an independent review, not just of the assault, but of Alicia's entire case history with the city's police department. Her record, flawless and unflinching, became a mirror against which the force's actions or inactions were measured. Reports surfaced of prior instances where Officer Mercer had received complaints for racial profiling. Some were buried. Others were resolved with mandatory training that never led to change. When a local journalist published internal emails showing how those complaints were quietly archived, the dam broke. Protesters marched down Calhoun Street, holding signs that bore Alicia's image alongside the words, "Not just her, all of us." It wasn't just about Alicia anymore. It never had been. She was a symbol, a spark. But the fire had been waiting. Churches opened their doors for open forums. Pastors, lawyers, teachers, and survivors of similar abuse stood side by side, not asking for change, but demanding it. The tone had shifted. No more petitions asking to be heard. This was a movement insisting it would no longer be ignored. Inside the Charleston City Council, emergency legislation was drafted to establish a civilian oversight board with prosecutorial authority. For the first time, citizens, many of them black, many of them formerly unheard, would be seated at the table where decisions were made. And not just seated, empowered. Alicia Monroe, still refusing interviews, didn't sit on the board. She declined every offer to lead, to speak, to become the public face of reform. But in private, she mentored those who did. At a late-night session in the basement of a community center, she met with young organizers offering legal guidance without pretense. Her notebook, now famous, was passed around like scripture. One of those organizers, a 27-year-old named Jada Reese, would later say She taught us that justice isn't just about what happens in the courtroom. It's about what happens when you leave it and whether the law still follows you. That line was etched onto a mural downtown, painted on the side of a formerly abandoned warehouse, a portrait of Alicia Eyes, forward beneath the words, "The law follows me now." But rebuilding wasn't just about laws or murals. It had to go deeper, into hearts, into training rooms, into the culture of silence that had allowed officers like Mercer to act unchecked for so long. The Charleston Police Department underwent a complete overhaul of its training protocol. Bias response programs were no longer optional. Officers were required to log community hours not as PR stunts, but as accountability rituals showing up not in uniform, but as humans among the people they served. And Mercer. His reckoning wasn't just legal, it was public. He was stripped of his badge and charged with felony assault, but it was his own words once shared in an email to a colleague that condemned him most. "You can tell who's trouble by how they look at you." That sentence read aloud in court sent chills down every spine in the room. He had judged a woman by her skin, by her calm, by her refusal to play small, and he had hit a judge. Alicia sat in the courtroom that day not at the bench, but in the gallery. No robes, no gavels, just presence. Mercer never looked at her. He couldn't. When the sentence was read, 3 years, no parole, she didn't react. Not out of indifference, but because justice for her was never about punishment. It was about restoration. And that would take more than one conviction. After the trial, Alicia returned to her home where dozens of letters from strangers waited. Some were from women who had suffered similar treatment. Others were from officers past and present who wrote to apologize, to reflect, to confess. One stood out. A young officer, newly recruited, wrote, "I used to think authority meant control. Now I see it means responsibility." That was when Alicia decided it was time to speak not for herself, but for the future. At a televised town hall, she addressed the community not as a victim, not even as a judge, but as a neighbor. Her voice was steady, but charged with the power of someone who had seen the worst and still believed in the best. "I do not stand here to shame. I stand here to rebuild. We cannot erase what was done, but we can choose what happens next. And if you're willing to see each other not as enemies, not as symbols, but as people, then this city, our city, still has a chance to become what it should have been all along." The crowd stood before she finished. In the weeks that followed, a new initiative launched, Monroe Fellows, a mentorship program placing at-risk youth with judges, lawyers, and civic leaders. It wasn't about grooming future elites. It was about making sure no one else would grow up believing their dignity was conditional. At the center of it all was Alicia, never seeking attention, but always present. Because this was never just about the blow. It was about what would rise from the ground it tried to flatten. Justice, in its truest form, doesn't always wear a robe or raise its voice. Sometimes it looks like a quiet shift in the way a city breathes. And in Charleston, long after the headlines faded and the courtroom emptied, justice began to grow in the spaces where harm had once lived. Alicia Monroe returned to work not to reclaim power, but to realign it. When she walked into the courthouse for the first time after the incident, no cameras followed, no crowds gathered. It was just her in a navy blue coat, carrying the same notebook she'd had in her hand the day she was assaulted. But inside those pages were not reminders of trauma, they were blueprints. The Monroe Fellows Program expanded within months. What began as a grassroots mentorship initiative quickly evolved into a city-funded pipeline for leadership and advocacy. High school students who once viewed courthouses as places of punishment were now walking through their doors as interns shadowing judges, clerks, even defense attorneys. Not to be reformed, but to be informed. To see the system from within, and in doing so, to begin reshaping it. One of those students, a shy 16-year-old named Marcus, stood at the back of a courtroom during a sentencing hearing and whispered to a mentor, "I used to think people like me only came here to get judged. Now, I want to come here to change the rules." That moment, small and unscripted, became the program's unofficial motto. But the real change could be felt in the smallest interactions. Officers who once stood stiffly at community events now showed up in plain clothes to listen instead of speak. A revised complaint process allowed residents to file anonymous reports without fear of retaliation, and each one was reviewed by a diverse panel that included citizens, not just department brass. Even the language changed. Terms like suspect and perpetrator were removed from internal forms unless a charge was filed. No more assumptions coded into paperwork. No more dehumanization by default. Judge Monroe, though she continued her duties on the bench, also began teaching a weekly civic literacy seminar at the local university. It wasn't part of her job. It wasn't for prestige. It was for students who had never imagined justice as something they could shape. Her sessions weren't lectures. They were conversations. Justice, she would say, is not a building or a badge. It's a practice, one that we have to repeat every day, even when no one is watching. The ripple effect extended well beyond Charleston. Other cities quietly adopted pieces of the Monroe model: civilian oversight boards, youth mentorship, policy rooted in community voice, not political pressure. And though Alicia rarely traveled to speak, her words traveled without her. A transcript of her town hall speech was read aloud at a national conference on policing reform. A line from her seminar: "The law does not begin when the sirens start. It begins when someone decides to see," was quoted in Congress during a debate on federal accountability legislation. But what justice looked like now wasn't just in policy shifts or institutional change. It was in the way people began to look at one another, in the way a young woman stopped a stranger in a cafe to say, "You taught my cousin. Thank you." In the way an officer paused before speaking during a traffic stop and said, "I just want to make sure you feel safe." Alicia Monroe never sought to become a symbol. But in choosing to stay, not just in the courtroom, but in the heart of the city that failed her, she became something greater than an icon. She became a compass, not flawless, not perfect, but unshaken in her belief that justice must live in the everyday. What does justice look like now? It looks like a black woman walking down King Street unafraid. It looks like a teenager stepping into a courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a future lawyer. It looks like a city no longer asking, "What did they do?" but instead, "What can we do better?" It looks like remembering not to stay angry, but to stay awake. And in Charleston, because of Alicia Monroe, justice is no longer a distant promise. It is something you can feel when you walk the streets. It is something you can see in the eyes of a child, the heart of a mother, and the silence that finally makes room for everyone to speak. Alicia Monroe's story is not just one of resilience, it is a reckoning, a revelation, and ultimately a redefinition of what power, justice, and humanity look like in modern America. It began with violence, a brutal, unjust blow delivered not just by a racist officer named Kyle Mercer, but by a system that too often confuses authority with impunity. On a quiet Charleston afternoon, a woman was struck not for what she did, but for how she looked, for being black, confident, and unafraid. Holt didn't see a person. He saw a threat. And in one careless, hateful moment, he exposed what too many have felt for far too long, that safety is not evenly distributed, and justice is not always blind. But the story didn't end with that strike. In fact, it began there. Because Alicia Monroe wasn't just a woman walking through a parking lot. She was the newly appointed Chief Justice of South Carolina's Judicial Oversight Board, the very authority Holt reported to. When her identity was revealed, it didn't just shock the department. It shook the entire city. What followed was not vengeance. It was something more difficult, more patient, and far more powerful. It was transformation. Alicia chose not to destroy the institution that failed her, but to confront it head on. She held the system accountable not with rage, but with unwavering clarity. Through public forums, quiet reforms, and an uncompromising commitment to truth, she challenged Charleston to do better. And Charleston responded. Protests turned into policies. Hurt turned into healing. The Monroe Fellows Program became a symbol of proactive change, empowering young voices to engage directly with systems of justice. Officers underwent empathy and ethics training. Procedures were rewritten, and more importantly, perspectives were too. But perhaps the most remarkable shift happened not in government offices or newsrooms, but in living rooms, in classrooms, in the unspoken agreements between neighbors. People began listening. They began seeing. The lines between us and them blurred, and conversations that once felt impossible now shaped everyday decisions. So what can we, the audience, take from Alicia's story? The lesson is simple but profound. True justice is not reactive. It is intentional. It requires courage not just in the courtroom, but in the small, quiet moments when we are tempted to look away. It demands that we examine not just the actions of others, but the biases we carry, the silence we allow, and the systems we participate in. In our daily lives, applying this means speaking up when something feels wrong, even if it's uncomfortable. It means asking deeper questions, listening to those whose voices have been ignored, and remembering that our inaction is never neutral. Whether you're a teacher, a parent, a business owner, or simply a neighbor, your choices help shape the world someone else must live in. Alicia Monroe didn't set out to be a symbol. She just refused to stay silent. And in doing so, she reminded us that dignity is not given by a badge, a title, or a bench. It's something we must protect in every interaction, every decision, every day. If this story moved you, if you believe stories like Alicia's deserve to be told and shared widely, we need your help. Subscribe to this channel so we can continue bringing you powerful narratives that inspire awareness, action, and real change. Your support is what keeps this conversation alive, and trust us, there are more stories worth telling. Together, we can make sure that dignity is no longer a privilege. It's a promise.